Hello, everyone. D. Wilmore, head of brokerage here at Radius. In this session, what we're going to be talking about is contingencies and removal of contingencies. What are contingencies? We talked about those things. Contingencies, in a simple way of saying, are those little safeguards that keeps a buyer from being in breach of a contract. It allows the buyer to do certain things over a period of time to make sure that what they're buying is in fact what they're buying. It also allows a buyer enough time to secure a loan, get all their documents in, make sure they're loan and credit worthy and they're getting a rate that they feel comfortable with within a given period of time. All right. So when we talk about contingencies and the removal of those contingencies, right off the bat, we think loan and appraiser. A loan contingencies, super crucial. Many people don't have the ability to purchase a home all cash. And so they get a loan. In other words, they go to a lender and they say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Lender, listen, I want to buy this house. I've saved up enough money to where I can contribute. How much are you willing to participate in? Typical loan to value from a bank would be somewhere around 80-20, which means 80% will be of the purchase will be provided through a loan from the bank and 20% from the buyer or some variant thereof. So most buyers working with agents up front will speak to a lender before they decide to make an offer to purchase, because it's important to know what your true buying capacity is, right? Once you purchase a property, let's say you go and buy $1 million house or put an offer in on $1 million house because you love it and it has everything you've ever wanted in the house, and you go to a lender and the lender says, man, I hated that you fell in love with that house because it's not within budget. You're really only qualified for $800,000 or less, right? That's why you want to go to a lender in advance of making a purchase. You, as a good agent, will make sure the day you meet your buyer that you'll start to talk loan and introduce them to your lender so that you can be well prepared when you are ready to make an offer on something that you've helped them to fall in love with. Okay. But that loan contingency period tells the seller, Mr. Mrs. Seller, we really like your house. We think we've got everything together. The bank is going to need to approve us. So we're going to need a few days. By default, it's 17 days. We're going to need 17 days to make sure that the lender can, come up with the money so that we can go ahead and purchase this house. Oh, and by the way, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, the same is true of the appraisal. Appraisers are pretty busy. The lender's going to order someone to come out and assess or appraise the home to make sure it is the value that you've asked for in your offering or your listing agreement. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, if the property doesn't appraise for the amount that we're hoping for, maybe we can negotiate, or I may have to walk away from this house. That's essentially the purpose of an appraisal contingency. And that loan and appraisal contingency typically go hand in hand because it's the lender who is most often ordering the appraisal. Okay. So those go hand in hand by default. Those are 17 days. In a competitive market, people like to adjust those numbers or eliminate those numbers altogether. And you can see that when it's checked no appraisal contingency or no loan contingency. Again, that could be very dangerous for your buyer because that doesn't allow your buyer to do their due diligence. But in a competitive market, sometimes we do what we need to do. We also want to make sure that we're investigating the property. Again, those things like a property and a pest inspection. If it's got a septic tank, I want to inspect the septic tank in the well. It's your position to make sure you're advising the buyer to do their due diligence, because you don't want them to have buyer's remorse or buyer's regret after they've purchased the house and found out it has all kinds of things that are going to be costly in order to remedy. Okay. We also want to cover, there we go. We talked about, sorry guys, little technical glitch here. All right. So in our next session, we're going to be talking a little more about title. So in title and escrow, that's where the seller is actually communicating as to where you're communicating to the seller and to the title and escrow people how you're going to take title. When it references here in title, it's the seller action providing you what's called a preliminary title report, making sure that you understand that the person who's actually selling the house is the person who can actually sell the house. Is there someone else on title? Are there other conditions, or are there other people who are claiming right to this property? Things like that. That's all demonstrated in what's called a preliminary title report. Typically, the seller is ordering a preliminary title report in advance of putting the property on the market. Sometimes they wait until after they've gone into contract, in which case that's then given to the buyer for the buyer to review to make sure they are, in fact, dealing with people who have the ability to sell the property. Is it a condominium or a PUD or planned unit development? All those documents also have to be shared with the buyer. Okay. And then, is the buyer removing or waiving their contingencies with the offer? Right. Again, very dangerous thing to do, but it is done from time to time, particularly in a competitive market. All right. And is there a contingency for the buyer to sell their property in advance, or after this property has been accepted for sale by the seller? So the buyer may have a property that they have to sell, so they may have a contingency. I'm going to buy your house, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, but I can't close the deal until my property sells first, which would be a contingency of sale of the buyer's property. Sometimes in a non-competitive market, you see those on a regular basis because the seller now feels like, I've had somebody who's interested in buying my house, and I'm willing to wait until that person sells this house because that may be where the money's coming from. Okay. All right, guys, as always, thank you for your participation. I will see you next session.